thank you all for coming, and there are many more thanks due. One foremost, to thank Dr. Barlow for inviting me, because PA began as a small project 2 years ago, and by allowing me to come here and present, I feel like PA has arrived and grown up. Thank you. And I also want to acknowledge two members of the audience. One is Professor Chen, who just earlier told us that he's the Chinese, unofficial Chinese historian, but I also want to say he's a busy one-man crusade who preserved a lot of stories, and I could not have presented today without all this personal collection of memorabilia. And the other is Miss Raymond Gee. She and the committee of Gee Family members published this Gee Family book on the 50th anniversary of the foundation of the Gee Family Association. And a lot of information from me also came with this book as well. So I'm going to begin today by telling you that we're going to go into a little bit of context of Chinese immigration. So in the middle of the 19th century, from about 1851 to 1875, China witnessed a massive exodus of immigrants going abroad, 10 million of them. Most of them settled in Southeast Asia, but of course some of them also crossed the Pacific Ocean and came to the West. So by 1848, the discovery of gold, news traveled very quickly across the Pacific Basin. In 2 or 3 days, the news reached China, especially the southeast coast of Guangdong. So by 1854, 24,000 or so Chinese workers worked around the mining area of Oregon and California. Contrary to our usual perception of a very poor, penniless immigrant who comes across to the West, to America, the Chinese immigrants came from different classes of society in China. There are middle class, lower middle class, and lower class. They came across with a systematic method of immigration, that family members would come across in a planned procession, and that they actually hope to make some money in the New World, go back to China, and improve on their livelihood at home. Of course, in many cases, they stayed in. That did not happen. Most of the people we are talking about today, especially members of the Gee family, came from 3 counties in Guangdong province. The 3 counties, the Taishan, or sometimes the Shiping County, the Kaiping County, and the Unping County in Guangdong. The Exclusion Act that came into being in the United States in 1882 was the first immigration law in this country, and it barred all Chinese laborers and the women, and the only Chinese allowed in were the merchants, the students, the diplomats, and the laws of those people. So the Chinese immigrants who came had to resort to a lot of fabrications in order to come in, and one of the most common practice is to become a paper son. This especially happened after the fire in San Francisco in 1906, where many Chinese who were in San Francisco could claim that they were actually citizens because their immigration records in San Francisco had to be burned. And as a result, since they were U.S. citizens, they could go back to China and bring their sons, who were born in China, across as U.S. citizens. So there was a phenomenon, a huge number of paper sons came across. So with this kind of fabrication and hiding, and many of the paper sons carried the secret to their graves, not because that they were afraid of exposure by the U.S. governmental authorities, but more because they're afraid of being blackmailed by the Chinese criminals in Chinatown. So it is in a way the historian's duty to try to ascertain fact from fiction, and try to see why they would choose to tell some of their stories, what kind of artifact they choose to keep, and what kind of stories they want to destroy, and what kind of artifacts they hide. And so in a way, the historian's role is to deny their ephemerality and to try to capture the moment in history. And the question very often asked me is, why are you studying the Gees of all the people in Houston? Well, it is kind of a personal curiosity. When I first arrived in Houston, my children's math teacher was Mrs. Gee. And then I took my mother-in-law to the hospital for a nutritionist with Molly Gee. And then my husband would meet an immigration lawyer named Harry Gee. And I went to are all the Chinese ask around and all related to all of each other. Except the relation is a little tenuous in the sense that they are all mainly from the 3 counties I mentioned above. They knew each other because they lived in different villages in these counties. They're not exactly blood related. And as you see later in the story, the definition of being a Gee expanded to becoming anybody who knew a Gee, anybody who knew somebody in that village, they were all Gees. So the method that I use, of course, is to use the memorabilia that were given to me, canceled checks, receipts, pictures, oral interviews that I collected, and in order to contextualize it, I also went to find some financial statements and maybe some legal restrictions. So I looked into a book called Dun & Bradstreet Credit Agency Report 1952. For those of you who do business, you'll know Dun & Bradstreet is actually a crediting agency. They come across the country every year and they assess the worth or the sale of different businesses. It's actually a private document. For some reason, the 1952 copy was left in Houston in the archive, and so I was able to access it. Because when I called Dun & Bradstreet asking for a past record, they said, "I'm sorry, this is confidential information, you cannot access it." And other things I used were the deed restrictions for neighborhood real estate companies, and also some of the statutes, civil statutes of Texas, and also many things as you can see. So coming to Texas, the Chinese came to Texas first in 1870 to build the Houston and Texas Central Railroad. Their industriousness and the willingness to receive low pay quickly earned them the huge anger and hatred of the white railroad workers. So they were basically chased out after they were done, or some of them left even before they finished the railroad. Eventually, however, some of them settled. So by 1910, maybe 600 Chinese were left in the state. In 1916, General John Pershing was appointed by the President Woodrow Wilson to chase after a Mexican bandit, Pancho Villa, who had been attacking businessmen along the Texas-Mexico border and to try to annihilate him. So Pershing went into Mexico, but there were Chinese in Mexico who were all trying to come across the border. So when Pershing went with his troop to Mexico, no Mexican would provide any services for the American troops except for the Chinese. So the Chinese followed Pershing's guns and men around, did the laundry, provided food for them. So when the expedition was over, Pershing basically appealed to Congress saying that even despite the exclusion law, if he left these loyal Chinese in Mexico, they would surely be killed by the Mexicans. So the Congress allowed Pershing to bring in 500 Chinese to a military base in San Antonio, and this was another infusion of Chinese blood in Texas. They called it Pershing Chinese in 1917. So most of the Chinese before 1940 congregated around San Antonio and also El Paso, which was a railroad town. Eventually, they came to Houston. And they came to Houston largely due to several leaders or elders of the Gee family, if you will. Two of them related, brother C.Y. Chu and Wong Chu, they're related. And then an unrelated Gee family member, Harry Gee. And I'll explain that Chu, C-H-U, and Gee, G-E, as well as J-E-E, are all the same rootinizations of the same Chinese character, Zhu. So C.Y. Chu actually had a scholarship from the Yunnan College in Hong Kong to come and study at Berkeley in California. I'm not sure if it's the same Berkeley University, but it's Berkeley College. He graduated, could not be hired by anybody. So the San Antonio Chinese businessmen hired him to come to San Antonio and teach Chinese to their children. He was not very happy with that. He came to Houston to explore his prospects and found that it was conducive for opening grocery stores. So they called on his brother and then told him to come and do the same. And eventually they trained a whole coterie of young men to start business grocery stores. Harry Gee, whose story we'll tell later, did a similar kind of mentoring for people who open restaurants. And then this was the reason why there's so many Chinese businesses that begun in Houston and not in the laundry business. They're all grocery stores or restaurants. So the first store that C.Y. Chu started was in 1930 on Dowling Street. It's called Wong. And here's a picture of C.Y. Chu in with this man over here. And I think some of the members are people that he met and introduced to the grocery business. So as he said, C.Y. Chu is the middle. This is his satellite of grocery stores. He had actually 7 grocery stores that he began at different times. People who came to Houston that he would welcome were the extended Gee family. They're all cousins. As you can see, the names of the people who he mentored in the grocery stores are all listed. It's a large group of people. And what he did was to basically set them up. He would lend them some money, and they would become partners in the grocery store. And the grocery store can be done with very small capital, maybe $3,000. And eventually, these partners would buy more and more shares of the grocery store as they earn money, and then buy out Chu. And that's how Chu kind of grew and mentored these people. So eventually, and I don't have a timeline for this, but this is some of the grocery stores that were in Houston, perhaps in the 1930s and 1950s, started by the different Gee family members. And you can see some of the network. For instance, if they were operational in 1952, I was able to get information from the Nebraska report. So one Chu store actually had a net asset of about $10,000 to $20,000 in 1952, and the credit rating was good. Sun Yik, which is a smaller store, had an asset of $5,000 to $10,000. Again, credit rating was good, which meant that they paid their debts on time and there was no problem of foreclosure. Jun Yik, which I think is Virginia's dad's supermarket, had a market value of $10,000 to $20,000. And then a smaller cousin with a smaller budget operated a series of stores and with very small capital up to $1,000. But again, the credit rating was good. So this gives an idea that even though the immigrants were beginning at a very low level in Houston, they slowly climbed up. They were maybe middle class at this point, but they were in business. They were solidly in business in Houston. Except that they were up against quite a lot of restrictions. For instance, this is a deed restriction on 1957, where it clearly said that no part of said property shall be sold, conveyed, rented, or leased in a whole or in part to any person of the African or Mongolian races. So many of the Chinese grocery stores were in the African American neighborhood. There was no zoning, there's still no zoning restriction in Houston, so grocery stores can pop up anywhere the owners want to put them down. And because most people did not have cars in the 1930s and 40s, grocery stores popped up every other block, and they're all mom-and-pop shops. And the Chinese had a symbiotic relationship with the African Americans because both could not live in a white neighborhood, both could not get credit or borrow money from white bankers, and many of them were restricted to public places that they could not go to. However, the African American customers were able to obtain credit from the Chinese grocery stores. So it was a good relationship. But eventually, as the neighborhood changed, some of the Chinese grocers decided to sell out because the neighborhood became dangerous. And I think Regine had told me your parents were robbed many times in the end. So the stories of some of the grocers I interviewed. Mr. Raymond Gee, who is really not related to Harry or Wong Chu or to any of the Gees, but he's a cousin of the Gee group. He came to San Francisco on his own at age 10 and had a paper mother in San Francisco who had taken care of so many other paper sons that she had no time for him. So he would go to school and come home really starving and very little to eat. He learned to polish shoes at 10 cents a pair on the streets of Chinatown from the older boy. And the older boy eventually discarded the older shoebox, and Raymond bought it and had to pay overtime for 6 months and giving him half of his profit every day. And in 6 months of bought the shoebox. Raymond was hungry all the time, and he said that the Italian window washer at school would take pity on him and then pay out of his own pocket for maybe a piece of bread for Raymond. His teacher at school, Mrs. Goldsmith, would go out and buy graham crackers and milk for him after school because she knew he was always hungry. And he said in the wintertime, he was so cold that he wanted a pair of mittens, and nobody lifted a finger to help him buy it until Mrs. Goldsmith found out what he needed and wanted for him. So kindness of strangers he remembered for a long time. But he always said, I want to be somebody, and I just don't want to be nobody. So finally, 3 years after he's been to San Francisco, his brother called him up in Houston. His brother actually had a grocery store in Houston, and then brought him to Houston, and he began to work in his brother's grocery store. He finally earned enough money, and on his first occasion, he went back to San Francisco because in San Francisco, when he was so hungry, he stole from many vendors who swipe spaghetti, cookies, even comic books. So he went back and went to all of these establishments and talked to these owners. Said, well, you don't know me. I used to take stuff from your place. I am doing pretty good now. I want to pay you back. I want to pay back everybody. And the only person who couldn't pay back was Mrs. Goldsmith. I guess he couldn't find out where it was. But so Raymond eventually bought out his brother's grocery store, and he found the best way to earn money is to buy foreclosed business. So he would buy foreclosed grocery stores, other people forfeited, kind of stocked them up, made a money, and sold it. So from one foreclosed business to another, he began to accumulate capital. At one point, he ran 15 grocery stores. And eventually, he bought fried chicken franchises, he bought washaterias, he bought savings and loan banks, and he bought apartment buildings. So by the time I interviewed Raymond, he was doing very well. But as most of the immigrants we interviewed, he declined to tell me what his net worth was and what he was doing, but I can surmise by the kind of information I was getting, he's doing very well. So usually in a cash economy. Another gentleman, Gordon Gee. Gordon Gee actually is one of the three famous brothers that we hear again and again in this presentation. He was actually born in New Orleans. His father was a leader of the Chinese community in New Orleans. But when his father died, and Gordon was just a few years old, his widowed mom took the children back to China because she couldn't make a living in New Orleans. But she systematically sent them one by one back to the United States. Gordon was the youngest of the three, and eventually his older brothers came, settled, brought him back. Again, he came back with another cousin who was held up at Angel Island. So while waiting for the cousin to be released, Gordon was polishing shoes in San Francisco, Chinatown again, as 10 cents a pair. But luckily, he didn't have to wait long. He waited something like 6 months, and then came to Houston and began to work in Sunday, which is one of the CY Chu satellite grocery stores. Out of Sunday, he was doing so well that he talked to the supplier, the meat supplier to Sunday, Mr. Rayner, and Mr. Rayner hired him as a salesman for the meat company. And Raymond quickly sold up all the accounts of the 340 Chinese grocers in Houston at the time, and became the #1 salesman for Rayner Meat Packing Company in 3 months. And he was making something like $500 to $800 a month, and this is early 1940s, which is quite a bit of money. He eventually figured out things that Rayner wasn't doing well, and he could have done better, so he left Rayner and started his own Oriental wholesale meat company. And by then he knew his way around, even though he had maybe 3-4 years of American school education. And eventually he tried his hand at Gee restaurants, and he told me over the phone very proudly that at one point in time, north of Buffalo Bayou was the Gee's restaurant, and south of Buffalo Bayou was Bill William restaurant, and these were the two go-to restaurants in Houston where the politicians gathered and all the hotshots met. Eventually, he branched out into more businesses. He was vice president of something called the Twin County Transvideo Cable Company, started by his brother-in-law in Pennsylvania. He owned the Tidy Roof International Company, where he started washing people's tiles in the roof and made a lot of money there. And what's even more ingenious, he sent a Caucasian man that he hired to the oil fields in Texas. And this guy would dress up as a worker and go into bars at night to hear where the oil might have been discovered that day. And when this guy heard it, he ran back to the hotel, changed his suit, drove to that place, and then went into the homes of those people who owned the land and the rights of the oil, talked them into selling the oil rights to this guy. And this guy came back to Raymond in Houston, and then went into this Epsom building or somewhere in downtown where the oil interests were exchanged. So Raymond said, I could have, if I were in business today, I could easily make millions of dollars. Maybe not billions, but millions of dollars easily. And Raymond has a just very keen eye for business. So, and then now he's retired and he owns many real estate properties, and all he does is collect rent. So here's another success story. But of course, I don't have his network either. And from the booklets and all the information Ed and Regine gave me, we know that in 1949, there were more grocery stores, like 49 grocery stores in Houston, and just a few, like 10 restaurants in Houston. By 1980, the situation reversed. There were fewer 100 grocery stores, about 300 Chinese restaurants. And this is reflective of the changing condition of the Chinese community. There was a much greater number of Chinese settling in Houston, and the demand for Chinese cooking has also increased a lot. Harry Gee Sr. is this gentleman whose pictures in the Chinese passports was to the Chinese restaurant owners, what CY Chu was to the grocery store owners. Harry Gee Sr. also lived in New Orleans, and he knew the father of Gordon Gee. So when Gordon Gee's father, who was the leader of New Orleans, a Chinese town in New Orleans, died, Harry Gee kind of took over his role. Eventually, Harry Gee found that it wasn't enough just to open a restaurant in New Orleans. He started figuring out anywhere there's oil, there's always money to eat. So he would open a restaurant in Memphis, Texas, and also Lake Charles, Louisiana. These are all places where oil was found. And eventually found Houston to be extremely conducive to restaurant business. And then started calling his friends, the Wongs from Mississippi, and the other members from Arkansas, just to come over and, you're all cousins, just come over and I'll help you, I'll give you a job in my restaurant and then start you off. And this is what he did. He was also very innovative. He opened a restaurant called the Chinese Village, and this is an advertising I found in Houston Chronicle. The Chinese Village was actually a drive-in restaurant, and there were very few drive-in restaurants in 1940. And what they did was to staff the important position in the restaurant with family members. So there's a G member doing the cashier, G member cooking, G member doing the order, translating the order from the Western customers to the Chinese cooks like that. But the car hops were all Caucasian women in very short clothes. Gordon told me, and I don't know, anyway, Gordon told me that we say that the women wore 2 handkerchiefs. I said, I'm sorry, it's 2 handkerchiefs, one on top, one on bottom, and that's all they wore. So the Chinese really did a lot of business until World War II, when oil became rationed and there were fewer cars driving, and so the business went under, and then he opened other restaurants. Interestingly, Harry mentored many young men in his business, and his children helped out growing up in the restaurant. But none of his children went into the restaurant business, as we all know, it's a very tough, long-hour business. His son, Harry Gee Sr., whom we all know, he's a very well-known immigration lawyer in town. He's a Rice graduate, president of the Rice University Alumni Association, very, very active in the Asian American community, has earned numerous awards for helping bring visibility to the Asian American cause. He founded the Asian American, Law Association, was president, earned many, many other civic, and he's today part owner of the Texan football team in Houston. So we know that he's also doing extremely well. And his sisters also never went into the restaurant business. Now, then we come to this very colorful person, Albert Gee. Albert Gee is the brother of Gordon Gee. And Albert came to Houston after his mother took the 3 brothers back to China, all my earlier story, and then as she systematically sent son by son back to the States, Albert was the eldest and was sent back to San Francisco first. And when Albert got to San Francisco, Harry Gee, who knew his father in San Francisco, New Orleans, said, come to Houston, I'll help you. So Albert came to Houston because of Harry Gee, started working in the Chinese Village and in other of Harry Gee's restaurants, and very soon branched out. And he did a magnificent job. First of all, he and his brothers said, we don't want to work for anybody else. We're only going to work for ourselves. And he said, when the policemen come to have coffee, don't charge them any money. Coffee's only water, but the sight of the police cruiser outside the restaurant is a great crime deterrent. Similarly, with politicians, they either pay free or at a discount. And so very soon, Albert built up a reliable and important clientele. He also built a restaurant called Polynesian on Main Street, very close to a hotel called the Shamrock Hotel. In the heydays of the Shamrock Hotel, it's where all the outside entertainers would come and entertain. People like Bob Hope and all the famous Hollywood people. And they would all come to have lunch at Polynesian next door, and very often brought by the Social Society columnist of Houston Chronicle named Maxine Messenger. And of course, Albert did not charge him anything, and Maxine would write about Albert's restaurant constantly in column, and that's how he built up the glamorous aspect of his business. What else? And you can see he's very imaginative. Here's a picture of his daughter, Linda Gale Wu, who, the subtitle here is Confucius Says Yum Yum. He also pioneered more refined Cantonese cuisine by getting chefs from Hong Kong. So instead of chop suey, he would have lobster Cantonese. He also would combine Polynesian food and Japanese food and Chinese food in the same restaurant, and infuse a lot of exoticism and glamour into his cooking. And of course, here's a picture of Albert being Houston Restaurateur of the Month. But what is amazing, because he entertained so much city politicians and other politicians, that when Richard Nixon came to visit Governor Connolly in Texas, Albert and his wife, Jane, here, were invited to Connolly's ranch. and Albert and Jane also were invited to the White House. But even more important than that, Albert was elected to be the head of the Houston Restaurant Association, the president. And this is just overall Houston Restaurant Association. He managed to integrate the restaurants in Houston. And to my amusement, constantly takes a Chinese to solve the issue between black and white in Houston. And I asked his wife, how did he do that? And she said, well, first of all, he was on very good terms with a man named Julius Carter, who was the leader of the African American community. So besides persuading members of his association to allow blacks to eat in the restaurants, he also had to persuade the African American community to come in and eat the restaurants. And in that fashion, he brought about a peaceful and orderly integration of the Houston restaurants. And not only did he help in civic way in this way, he was also the head of an organization called the Chinese American Citizens Alliance. And this organization would help the Chinese grocers and allow them to understand the regulations of government. For instance, the people who handle food had to have a health card in order to operate the grocery store. And you have to have vaccinations, and all of these bureaucratic steps were taught to them by members of CACA, and Albert and his wife Jane were constantly helping them. So here's an overview of the restaurant scene, again for the Gee family members. Harry Gee, who began earlier, had the main cafe, Sun Deluxe, China Clipper in 1952 had annual estimated sale of $500,000. Chinese Village, everything else drive-in, and another smaller restaurant, the China Store, that had an estimated sale of $75,000 to $100,000. Albert Gee's restaurant came a little later, and he opened maybe 8 restaurants. I think Linda, his daughter, and Jane, his wife, are not clear that's all the extent of his restaurant, but I think from record, it seems to be 8. The one that I could find information on was Bing Hao. In 1952, again, estimated sale $75,000 to $100,000. Others, for instance, Gordon Gee's brother opened Gee's restaurant. Wallace Gee, who is actually Albert and Gordon's brother, had a restaurant called Frontier Restaurant. And interestingly, because of the cordial relationship between Albert and the police, Wallace actually opened a cafeteria inside the police headquarters. And other Gees, for instance, Chester Gee had a Chester Gee restaurant, the Four Seas, and Silver and Jimmy Gee. And I don't think Jimmy Gee and Chester Gee are related to Mary or but they're all Gees. So we can see in this picture they're doing well. They may not be super rich, but they're doing very, very well, especially Albert and Harry. So now we go to the women who have been working silently along their male partners. Jane, Albert's wife, grew up in San Antonio on top of the grocery store. Her father was very insistent on Jane getting a good education. So after American school every day, they went to Chinese school every day. And she got into Rush University in 1940, and she was on a pre-med track. Except that she met Albert on her way to school every day, and Albert, courted her, so she dropped out of Rice and married Albert. She said she was so afraid of her father's reaction, she did not come home for about 9 months. And when she finally went back home, Albert was so charming that her dad was no longer mad at her. So she then, Albert had 2 grocery stores as well as a restaurant at the time he married Jane. So he let her run 1 grocery store and a takeout restaurant while she stayed home to raise 2 daughters. And he went on to open more restaurants. Jane was active along her husband. When he became president of CACA, she wrote many of his speeches, and she knew exactly how CACA operated because she was president of the Women's Auxiliary. And so she was active, and she eventually became president of CACA herself, and she ran this Chinatown pageant for CACA, which is kind of a wonderful way for a young lady to be groomed in Chinese society, in Chinese American society at the time, in the 1950s and 60s. And she said that I was a tough cookie because I insisted on running the pageant my way, and she was chairman of the pageant for about 15 years and passed the baton to her daughter. And we have another member of the Gee family. Notice her last name is spelled J-E-E. And she came from Mississippi because her father realized that in Mississippi, Chinese kids could not go to school with the white kids, unlike Texas. So the definition of Asians in Houston or Texas is kind of ambiguous. They could not buy property because they're Mongolian race, but they could go to school with the white people. So Martha went to school, went to UT, was tapped to join the white sorority, and actually became president of the sorority, tried to integrate the sorority, but failed. Upon graduation, she went into education, became a teacher, school administrator, assistant superintendent, and on chance opportunity became professor at Baylor University, came back, and another chance opportunity ran for city council, and Gee actually was her campaign manager, won 3 terms, and then eventually became a state representative. And I think I'm sorry that I misremember, she's not state senator, she's state representative. And she was also tireless in advocating for the Asian American cause. Another member who is in our audience is Raymond Gee. Raymond's father came in as a paper son. For the longest time, their last name was Wong, and it was not until the amnesty of 1960s when people were pardoned and allowed to become U.S. citizens that their dad decided to revert that name back to Gee, G-E-E, and Raymond said the entire family had to change their last name to Gee. Raymond pursued a course of social work through advocacy and public policy. So of the many, many accomplishments and jobs she's had, I can only list a few, and she right now is involved in the Texas Asian American Redistricting Initiative. She had been with the United Way, the Asian Chamber of Commerce, she was president, ran the campaign for Martha, and then started the Asian American Family Services and the Asian American Health Coalition, among many other things. And Home Clinic, and both the Asian American Family Services and the Home Clinic have become million-dollar budgeted, federally funded operations that service mental health as well as physical health of the indigent community as well as other non-Asian members of society in Houston. And I think when Gee talked to our interview students, she basically kind of summarized what I think is her life philosophy. I'd like to solve problems, connect resources with needs, and make things happen. The best legacy is that it continues after you're gone, so that it's not about you. So then the gentleman yesterday, I think Professor Chugo wanted to know, is there a Chinatown in Houston? And I think the answer is yes. But beyond the individuals who started schools, organizations, restaurants, there are larger, broader umbrella organizations that took care of the other legal issues, social issues of immigrants. In the 1930s was an organization called YQ. Later it was taken over by Onlyong and his Sing Merchant Association. And then later family associations like the Gee Family Association came up. And now we have the CACA, the Chinese American Citizens Alliance, the Baptist Church, the Chinese Community Center, and today they're a gazillion organizations. A note about the Onlyong and his Sing. Many of us have read and Googled that there are tongue wars. These are not only merchant associations, they have a darker side. There are also organizations that are sometimes run by gamblers, underground criminals who also have, in the old days, sold opium, and today maybe human trafficking. And they have turf battles in Chinatown, especially in New York and in Chicago. The Houston Onlyong was implicated in one of those racketeering charges in 1990. It was acquitted in 1993. I have not had a chance to ask my interviewees what their knowledge of Onlyong is, but we have to know that there is some gambling in there from the very beginning. I think Gee told me that after school they went to Onlyong for social dances, but also there were men playing mahjong and gambling upstairs. So there's the other side that we haven't yet started exploring. In conclusion, I want to say, and I have to stress this again, there were 22 families whose stories were told in this booklet. And I looked into them and constructed family trees for many of them. But I can only find maybe 4 clusters, 4 groups of people who related. Harry Gee and Harry Gee's family related to Albert and Wallace and Gordon, because Albert and Wallace and Gordon's grandfather was Harry Sr.'s father. So there's that group that's related. But there's no relation between C.Y. Chu, Wong, and anybody else. So they're alone by themselves. And there's another 2 brothers, Wing Choi Chi and Wing Huan Chi related. But beyond that, nobody's related. They're all his cousins. But what made Gee successful to me is that there are these far-sighted, very generous elders, such as C.Y., Alto, Harry, Albert, Gordon, and Wallace. They allowed to include non-blood relatives, strangers into their homes, gave them their financial help, supported them, let them stay on their feet, and then backed off. At the same time, they also welcomed the younger Gee members, allowed them to take over the leadership of some of these organizations. So they perpetuated the civic service for these members. And also they had very good relations with the larger community, with the police, with the politicians, and they secured legal protection for their family members in an era where discrimination was rampant. So that's it. Thank you very much.